Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're pleased to have Naeem Mohaiemen today as the presenting artist in OCAD University's Art Creates Change lecture series, and also to have Jaret Vadera in conversation with him today as well. We're pleased to have all of you here to learn and to be part of the discussion as well. Before the introduction, before Naeem's talk, before he and Jaret converse, before the Q&A, and before the following reception, we would like to acknowledge the land and place on which we hold this event tonight. OCAD University acknowledges the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we create, study, and gather this evening. The meeting place of Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community of OCAD University on this territory. Over the last few years of doing land acknowledgements, each time I have to prepare, I am confronted with the question of what we are doing when we list the nations that have preceded us here, when we consider our responsibilities to think through how we go forward, when we consider the implications of decolonization here on this land, and also for many of us on the places from which we immigrated to this land. For my own location, I think about Israel and Palestine and the colonial project that has led to Palestinian dispossession in the seeming impossibility and yet the need for decolonial discourse. In the context of today's presentation, I think about the partitions of 1947, UN-sanctioned and ill-conceived, of Palestine and of India and Pakistan, East and West, and then, of course, subsequent Bangladesh. Doing land acknowledgements is a call to memory and action, and I have found it also to be personally grounding. I am here, we are here. We acknowledge that this territory is part of Treaty 13, that we are all part of that treaty and responsible to actively learn what that may mean. And before Treaty 13, this area was covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement of First Nations to peaceably share, care for, and preserve resources and game. In principle and practice, the Dish with One Spoon agreement was about resource sharing. As such, our university, in a collective act, has chosen not only to acknowledge this historical reality, one that has been denied and suppressed, but to work actively towards ways in which it may be rectified. Quoting from the first principle of OCAD's academic plan, OCAD understands that transformative education, after the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, requires that we critically transform the settler social relations that underpin knowledge production and what constitutes knowledge within the university context and beyond. Close quotation. This is part of the process of decolonization. That is, faculty and administration, as well as students, are actively searching for best practices and for ways by which to do, in quotes, decolonization with a responsible and justice-oriented perspective. Whatever decolonization may mean, at this point, it is not an arrival space, but a process, a priority, and a continued conversation. So, welcome again to Art Creates Change, to our lecture series. And before we go ahead with the lecture and with the conversation, I'd like to say a few of the thank yous right off the top. And the first thank yous are to our past dean, Vlad Spikanovich, for supporting Art Creates Change. He's supported the series through all these many years, and to also interim Dean Glenn Lowry. After valued faculty member Kim Prusy died, Vlad decided to name the series after Kim because of her dedication to activist art making, to social justice, and to transformative education. We remember her valuable work as we continue with this series of presentations. I'd like to thank a few people who were involved in making this event possible. First of all, Ali Kadir for his beautiful design, a very beautiful poster. Ali teaches here in design, in Faculty of Design. Thank you to John Rubino and James Morrow in the Faculty of Art office, and to Renzi Guarin and to Jalen Gubatan, and Jalen's here. Thank you for tech support. Thank you to Crave Pava for catering. I hope you can all join us after this because there's some very yummy food, and hope you can share it with us. And thank you to Elaine Corris, who is here doing ASL support as well. So about 3 years ago or so, Richard Fung and Min-Suk Lee and I were brainstorming, as we have done, and the three of us had been taking turns and collaborating on programming Art Creates Change. And Richard was the one who brought forward Naeem's name. And so I contacted Naeem, it must have been 2 or 3 years ago, somewhere, maybe 2 years ago or something like that. And he was in this vortex, the PhD vortex. And so he said no. And so then just this spring, I contacted him again, and he said yes. And he said, and you might be interested that my work is at the power plant. So there was this funny convergence, as it were, in terms of this moment where power plant had curated 4 of Naeem's works, which are, Lauren will tell you in a minute. And so what was great is he introduced me to Lauren and to Josh at the power plant, and it's been a really terrific to be able to collaborate with Josh and Lauren at the power plant. So Josh Hoyman is Curator of Education and Public Programs, and Lauren Barnes is the Curator of Exhibitions at the power plant. At the Power Plant Contemporary, and Lauren will be coming up to just say a few words about the exhibition.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So my name's Lauren Barnes. I'm Curator of Exhibitions at the Power Plant. We at the Power Plant are hugely grateful to OCAD University for their ongoing partnership of which this is really just one aspect, and we're really happy to be working together to stage this program on the occasion of Naeem's exhibition, which is titled What We Found After You Left. I've had the really great privilege of working with Naeem on this ongoing project, which opened on the 21st of September at the power plant, and it runs right through until the 10th of May next year. This is a kind of unusual exhibition format for us. In embarking on the project with Naeem, we really wanted to allow our visitors to have a really broad sense and a deep dive really into Naeem's work. And so this prompted this idea to have an exhibition format which takes place over 4 sequential chapters across the 6 months of the exhibition. So in each of those chapters, we're presenting not only one of Naeem's films from the past 8 years, but also a group of accompanying works alongside, which we're describing from taking Naeem's lead as footnotes. And when you come to the exhibition, as some of you may have already, what you encounter first are the footnotes. And so we're kind of upending the typical hierarchy between text and footnote, and in this way really seeking to underline Naeem's approach to writing history, which we see in all of his films, which is really to move the marginalia to the center of our field of study. And the thing that I think is really interesting about thinking about footnotes as a kind of broader guiding principle for looking at Naeem's work is, I mean, there are many potential ways of looking at this. One is, the fact that the footnote is conventionally a place for evidence, and this is something that Naeem really interrogates and questions in the way that he works with archives of different kinds. But footnotes are also a place where authors are sometimes funny, where they allow themselves to make a joke and point at an absurdity. And they're also a place where authors might suggest contradictions or complications to a story, which are all really vital elements in the way that Naeem makes his works. And what makes his films and his works in other media so compelling. So the whole project, what we found after you left, began in September. We showed Tripoli Cancelled from 2017, Naeem's first fiction film, a kind of surrealist fable set in Elinikon Airport in Athens. This week, we just switched over to chapter 2 of the exhibition. So we're we're sticking with the airport films with United Red Army, the first film from the series titled The Young Man Was, made in 2011, which is focusing on the 1977 Japanese Red Army aircraft hijacking in Dhaka airport. This film is running until January 5th, 2020, and then Chapter 3 begins on the 25th of January next year, where we show the 3-channel film Two Meetings and a Funeral, also from 2017, also presented like Tripoli Cancelled for the first time at Documenta 14. This really takes a kind of broader look at the period of the 70s, which is so central to Naeem's work, and looks at this pivot between the non-aligned movement and the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. And then the last film begins on the 18th of March, 2020, and runs right to the 10th of May. And this is Afsan's Long Day from 2014, also from the series The Young Man Was, which really takes us in a number of different directions, really from Baader-Meinhof right to Bangladesh in the 70s through the memories of the journalist Afsan Chowdhury. Naeem and Jaret are going to talk much more about these films, so I will leave those kind of very brief summaries there. So please do come to the power plant for the exhibition if you haven't already. Please come for each of the 4 chapters. All of the dates are on our website. And I also wanted to briefly mention that we're in the process of producing an edition of our Power Plant Pages series in relation to the exhibition. This is going to be ready in time for chapter 3. So thank you again, Naeem, for the wonderful collaboration on the exhibition, and to Jaret for joining Naeem this evening, and again to OCAD U for the wonderful partnership. So I'll now hand over to Richard to introduce Naeem and Jaret. Thanks.
So I'd just like to tell you how the evening will go. Naeem's going to speak for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then he and Jaret will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for 30 minutes, and then we'll end it there, and then you can come and eat and talk further. So I'd like to introduce Richard. Richard Fung is sadly our retired faculty at OCAD, but we don't want to sever the thread, so we keep calling him back for things. And of course, Richard is so much more. He's a video artist. He makes critical work that have global reach. He is a writer, theorist, and lecturer, and one of the best cooks, which is also connected to some of his work. And Richard will introduce Naeem and Jaret. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, good evening. I hadn't thought I'd ever actually be standing in front of this podium again. But I have to say I am ecstatic to be here on this occasion, because I first came across Naeem's work at the Images Festival a few years ago, and had been interested in his work ever since. And then I was at Documenta in 2017, and his installation Two Meetings and a Funeral was the piece that really stuck in my head, and I thought, this has to come to Toronto. How is it going to come to Toronto? So I'm so pleased that it has come to Toronto. It will be here, and that I get to do this introduction. I really think that you all need to see this work. Okay, so I will do the introductions to, I'll start with Jaret. Jaret Vadera is a transdisciplinary artist whose work explores how different social, technological, and cognitive processes shape and control the ways that we understand the world around and within us. His paintings, prints, photographs, videos, and installations have been exhibited and screened internationally at venues such as the Queen's Museum, MoMA, the Smithsonian, the Asia Society, and here in Toronto at the Aga Khan Museum, where I was very lucky to have seen that show and talked to Jaret then. In parallel, Jaret has worked as a curator, programmer, and writer on the projects that focus on art as a catalyst for social change. Jaret completed his undergraduate education here at OCAD, OCAD University, and the Cooper Union School of Art in New York, and he received his MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University. He's currently an assistant professor of practice in new media in the Architecture, Art, and Planning School at Cornell University. Naeem Mohaiemen combines films, installations, and essays to research former utopias framed by third world internationalism and world socialism. Despite underlining a left tendency toward misrecognition of allies, a hope for a future international left as an alternative to current polarities of race and religion is a basis for the work. The Power Plant is currently hosting a 6-month exhibition, as you know, so I won't go over that again. Naeem's previous Canadian solo exhibition was at Vox, Centre de l'Image Contemporaine in Montreal, and he premiered films at Gallery TPW, Hot Docs Images, and at SAVAC, South Asian Visual Arts Center. In March 2020, Prefix will host the launch of Solidarity Must Be Defended, an anthology Naeem is co-editing with Hungarian critic Eszter Szokács. After All Journal recently published essays on his films, co-edited with Charles Stankovic, and the Power Plant will publish a monograph based on this exhibition in spring 2020. Please welcome Naeem Mohaiemen.
Thank you, Richard, for the wonderful introduction. Since the Solidarity anthology was mentioned, I should just point out that this image is from the screening of Two Meetings and a Funeral at Transit in Hungary, organized by Eszter, which is how our current collaboration started, which was based on this idea that we were showing the film and they were saying, well, what are all the books that people should be reading? And I responded that I don't really want people to be reading books unless they want to anyway. The films are not meant to be a course syllabus. But then she said, no, you must give some. And then we started talking about various books, and then that turned into this anthology, which will come out next year, as mentioned. I'm presuming that sound is not from my computer. I'm hoping. So thank you, of course, to Richard, Mingsuk, and Yael for organizing this at OCAD, and to the entire team at Power Plant, Ketan, Lauren, Josh, Amin, and many others who have been very patiently dealing with the project in 4 chapters and the variations of the footnotes. Yael mentioned the PhD. I'm not sure which word you used, but I would think vortex. I would think wormhole. And there were certain points when, I don't know if it's a song or it's a phrase, I can't go on, I must go on, keeps flashing in your head. And consequently, the result of going through that experience is I've actually developed an allergy towards discourse in general. I'm sure it'll pass. I hope it'll pass. So Jaret and I were discussing today what we would talk about, and I could see in myself just the desire to show films and not explain them, which is also perhaps a peculiarity of the artist's talk, where, because of the format, you often show your work and then you explain your own work, and that's all fine and well and good. But also, I think sometimes by explaining, you cut off other possibilities, other interpretations. For example, Tripoli Cancelled, the airport film that Lauren mentioned, we just finished. I had somebody come up to me a couple of months back and said, well, of course it's a metaphor for the left. This guy's obviously a communist abandoned by his party, and that's why he's in Greece. And that's a concept that was nowhere in my head while writing or filming, but I thought it was wonderful. And I thought, how good it would have been if I wasn't there to correct this person. Because of course I was obliged to say, well, maybe, but that's, and then I thought maybe I shouldn't say that's not, because it also forecloses other meanings. In the talk today, I will talk a little bit, show brief clips of a couple of films, and talk about the idea of friendship and collegiality and collaboration among artists and artist communities, for me mainly in New York and Dhaka, but there are intersections with Toronto, as you'll see. This image here is actually from Jaret Vadera's work, which I wanted to put up because it's influenced me and kind of maybe leaked into some of my thinking. It's based on Blade Runner, the 1992 film, but this edition, I believe, this was made and shown in 2006. And we'll talk more about why it's up there later during our conversation. Jaret and I have had this collaborative relationship that's not always visible often, because we realize that oftentimes it's a conversation over coffee that then somehow seeps into a script 4 years later, and at some point I will think, where did that come from? And it'll take some time to decipher that that came from a conversation with him and with others. So I want to talk about that as well briefly. So I want to start with this book very briefly, John Berger's A Seventh Man, written in 1975 and sometimes referred to, I think John Berger himself said that it's a book that takes on new meanings as time passes. So when Berger first wrote it in 1975, a lot of the focus was on the changing European landscape. Obviously in 1975, the Soviet Union is a huge backdrop. Anything happening in Western Europe is being measured against how the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is doing. You know, by the time the 90s come along, that Soviet specter has disappeared and Western Europe has merged, quote unquote, with Eastern Europe. But the condition of the people who are the key focus of John Berger's book, the migrant workers, has not only continued, but has magnified to the point where today, I think the idea, the question, the quote-unquote problem of othering people within any society is paramount in many, many conversations. You know, obviously dominant in North America and Europe, but also there continuously in Latin America, Africa, Asia, in ways that are not necessarily recognized, because those who find themselves in a minority position post-migration are often very late to recognize their own position as dominant oppressors in their own context. I recently talked about the fact that in Bangladesh and in India, there's a lot of anxiety and discussion about how English language's dominance is making other languages disappear. Certainly in Bangladesh and West Bengal, Bengali as a language is starting to feel the encroachment of English. But we don't think about the fact that, for example, in Bangladesh, there are 13 indigenous languages that have disappeared because of the dominance of the language that I speak. So those kinds of slippages always interest me. So I want to actually talk about a juncture point that changed a lot of things for at least the communities that I work with in New York, of which Jaret is one key person. It's this exhibition called Fatal Love, South Asian American Art Now, which happened in 2005, which for the 22 artists who are in the show, except for 2 of them, I think for most of us, certainly for me, it was our first time in a museum, first time in an exhibition, first time even thinking whether we want to use the word artist to describe what we do, and maybe hesitating about that even 14 years later. The exhibition title itself is a profound conundrum for most of us. The year 2005 will tell you the context in which this came out and in the context in which a lot of my work and Jaret's work has circulated or changed, which is of course post 9/11, what we've called security panic in the United States. Which is different perhaps in ways from other discourses around migration that have circulated in the United States elsewhere, where very specifically the question of danger not just assimilation, not just culture, ... whatever it is, but about danger, and the other is a very particular form of danger, was front and center in the United States. And for at least 4 years, up to 2005 actually, it wasn't really possible to make or show work in any venue. You could do it in your own self-organized situations, but not in mainstream venues. And then this exhibition came along. It came through two curators, Prerna Reddy and Jayshree Abhichandani, who organized it actually as a response to an India show that was happening at Queen's Museum, which was happening downstairs. And they insisted that if there was going to be a country-specific show downstairs, that to a hegemonic country within the South Asian context, there has to be a South Asian, so a pan-identity show. And then, of course, they called it South Asian American, which Jaret and I were discussing this today. To be in an exhibition where we also had to ascribe to an identity of American was, Jaret is at least Canadian in some ways, and also has Filipino and Indian heritage, and I have Bangladeshi heritage. And in 2005, I certainly wasn't thinking of myself as an American. So even there was this whole thing about who in the exhibition even had US citizenship. Thankfully, it wasn't an INS questionnaire, so we could be in it. An exhibition that interpolated us into an identity we weren't necessarily ready for yet. For the exhibition, we walked into that identity, and then our work was, of course, written about from within that, right? The newspapers wrote about it as a South Asian American exhibition. And then we didn't have the opportunity to borrow that word again, to give the footnotes of who is from where and whether we fit in or not. And I started becoming aware of the ways that we were trying to make work, and we're trying to speak about things and speak about communities, and we were rapidly also becoming ambassadors for those communities, even though we didn't represent those communities if you bring in class into the equation, right? A lot of us came from the sort of middle class situation that even allowed trying to think of being artists, although that's of course not exclusively obviously the case, but certainly we were speaking on behalf of working class migrants, and then often taken to be from that situation, even though there could be many variations within that. And that continued to trouble me about this idea of representation.
There's also a concern, the greatest force in Islam is a call for justice. So not just us, justice, okay? And that's the difference. So when you look at this dynamic, this problem, this quagmire that you find us in many cases, where you have people who come in and they may be doctors, they may be engineers, they may be lawyers, and they come in with a mind that is already polluted because they come out of situations where their minds are polluted from where they come from. I'm not fooled on that by that at all. I'm very clear about that. People come out of situations, whether it's Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, doesn't make any difference. They come from places where there are poor people and where they're coming from a class system, and they transfer that in, and so they have a rich person's Islam and they have a poor person's Islam. They have a skin color Islam that says, we have been told that on a social level, black people are not really on par with the rest, whether they're black Africans or if they're black Americans. I've experienced it everywhere, man. I've experienced it at Hajj. I've experienced it on Hajj. People are people no matter what they say or where they go and what they do. And yes, we find this dynamic in play in many places. And I believe that racism and classism is one of Satan's biggest tricks. Because what did he say after all when God told him to submit himself to the human being? I'm better than them. And that's what do we say when we separate ourselves from people based on skin color, based on economics, based on race. I'm the Kairu Minu. I'm better than him. That's all we say. Before September 11th, there was not a whole lot of concern on the part of the Muslims who thought that they were safe because they had amalgamated. They were living next door to people from Intel. They were living next door to people with the high rollers, and they were nice and laughing and waving hands at them and coming over, eating rice and curry and saying, oh, how wonderful it is, and letting them fit right in. After September 11th, it was a big wake-up. All of a sudden, those people who thought that they were immune from the wrath of the system, if you will, found out that they were in the crosshairs of everybody, including their neighbors. Then all of a sudden, there became a greater interest, and I would say an accentuated interest in the methods and the voice and the social and political position of the African American Muslims who were veterans at addressing issues and defending themselves as African American people from some of the wiles and tricks and the approach that this system will use against you. You look at Keith Ellis. I mean, this man just became the first congressman, Muslim congressman. Okay, if you expose African American thinking through the media, and your concern is the growth of Islam, that it's already growing too fast, and you start exposing these articulate, thinking, progressive individuals, you're exposing their ideas to the world and to the population. There's a certain economic value. You don't want these people to start really getting out there like that, because the myths have already been well established and they're well in place. As long as Muslims are foreign and they're somebody else from somewhere else, I don't care how much you keep them in the camera, that's safe. But if you're talking about your next door neighbor, and you're talking about the judge down the street, and you're talking about the guy who went to high school with you, and you're talking about these prominent businessmen, and women, all of whom happen to be African American, and you start showing and displaying and getting this impact from them, you're going to give some people some ideas that maybe they ought to look at this Islam. You know what I'm saying? Maybe more of these African Americans will start looking at this Islam. And you got to understand that that is a concern in this country.
So I meant to actually explain the video before I played it, so I'll do it in reverse sequence. That's a piece called Invisible Man. It was one of 4 videos made for that particular Queen's Museum show. We made it as a collective. We were called Visible Collective. We were at our peak 10 people, 10 or more actually in the group. There's a website if you want to see more called disappearedinamerica.org. And the reason I showed that video, which is the 4th one in the series, Invisible Man, obviously from the Ralph Ellison reference, is that there was an expectation that if you're going to speak about post-2001 situation as somebody who is visibly is from that community, you should also be speaking within your silos, right? So the South Asian Americans, quote unquote, should be talking about the South Asian experience, Arab Americans, etc., etc. And we wanted to subvert that. We wanted to go against what we were supposed to speak about. And we also wanted to go against this idea of a unified community, because you might be temporarily unified because of policing and security, but it's very temporary. And within your community, there are all the fractures that remain and are temporarily papered over. So the reason that video, just to explain what I should have done before, the African-American man at the beginning, he is the imam of a mosque in Oregon, where there are not a lot of black mosques and not a huge black population. And the reason we interviewed him is because there was a quote-unquote terror cell that was arrested in Oregon, one among many of these quote-unquote cells, and this was an entirely African-American cell. And we were interested in this because in the media hype, of course, the figure of the outsider in this moment was visibly either Arab or South Asian, which were the 2 communities that could most clearly be grafted onto migration, which then offers a solution, of course, which has arrived in all sorts of ways today, but already was bubbling and brewing in 2002, which is that you raise the walls or the gates or the requirements. But in reality, in the United States, the largest community of Muslims in America are African Americans, by a ratio of they're the largest, followed by South Asians, followed by Arab Americans, because a large portion of the Arab American population is actually not Muslim. So it's an inversion of what the media presentation was, which we wanted to play with or push against, but it's also an inversion of the community's own conversation, because one of the things you start hearing when he really gets going is he's not actually, he of course talks about racism from the state, but then very soon he starts talking about racism that he faces from other Muslim communities, and he means South Asian and Arab. So the audio is a little hard to hear perhaps, but he says, when they were living next door to Intel and they were all happy. So it's also talking about tech community, a very early 2000 version of what maybe today is called tech bro. This was the previous generation, so Microsoft rather than Facebook. So we wanted to also do that because we wanted to shake this idea of unity within the community, because we found ourselves very rapidly being put into these public roles of requirement to speak, and which came at us with all these expectations of what we're supposed to speak on. What's our silo that we're supposed to, what's our lane that we're supposed to stay in? And we wanted to keep veering out of our lane. And the second thing, which I will get to in the next image, is that we also found it, after a while, enervating and a bit exhausting to always be reporting on events that were happening while we were talking about them. At a certain point, we said that it felt like being on a not a treadmill, the circular wheel that you run on, with television and CNN blaring on it, because you're constantly responding to the next news item and the next news item and the next news item. And so we also, and then at this point, I started making solo projects from inside the collective, because not everybody was on the same journey. Some of our members went to graduate school. 2 people became lawyers. Others went and did a PhD back then. So those of us who were remaining started going on different paths, and I became interested, or I was pushed into thinking about the 1970s revolutionary left as another way to think of today, which is what the Young Man Was series that Lauren talks about is about. Specifically about left uprisings in the 1970s, because it felt to me that that was a moment I could look at, we could look at and think of as a similar security panic, but with a very different other. At that time, the politics had to be identified by left, broadly speaking. And at that point, it wasn't so easily racializable. Although, of course, as you'll see, with the Palestinian movement's entrance, there was a way that parts of this could also be grafted onto an Arab identity, at least to the extent that parts of the Palestinian liberation organizations allied with things that were considered quote-unquote left in Japan and Germany. This is a clip, or still rather, from Eric Baudelaire's film, the Anabesis of Mei and Fusaku Shigenobu, or 27 Years Without an Image. It came out the same year as my film that's playing right now at Powerplant, which I'll show a short clip of. And speaking of conversations that rotate, I saw Eric's film right after I'd finished editing, and I remember having this intense relief that I hadn't seen it before, because speaking of the anxiety of influence, the solution that he came up with, which is you have an archive you're tracing, but you can't find it. There's no images. He was following the Japanese Red Army in Lebanon. And the solution he came up with included this really sharp idea of using the letters of a Japanese filmmaker who's asking Eric to go to Lebanon and shoot, because this Japanese filmmaker can't go to Lebanon because he doesn't have a passport. And he doesn't have a passport because he was involved with the movement in the 1970s. So I'm just going to read a very brief excerpt from an essay I had written about Eric's film. Because after I saw the film, I thought, okay, so he lives in Paris. We're on completely different continents. We're dealing with completely different situations. Although increasingly, of course, the French situation has converged in recent years with the American situation, especially in the last 7-8 years. We're on 2 different continents and we're working separately. We don't know about each other. And then we've somehow found our way to this same archive, because for both of us, somehow the Japanese Red Army, which is what both his and my film were about, was a way to try to understand what was happening post-2001. It was a way to have a conversation about now without talking about now, because you're making a route through something else. And I started thinking a lot about this idea of exile, another form of disappearing. Because when we did the Disappeared in America project, we're talking about people disappearing in plain sight, either through incarceration or disappearing by the sort of othering that the state was doing. So this is a brief text from a longer essay called The Anabesis of Wandering, which came out in eFlux. So this is a bit where I talk about Eric's film. If such premonitions of contradiction appear in a film made when the Japanese Red Army was at its zenith, this is a film that was made in the 70s, how have the filmmakers navigated the space of revolutionary exile when failure is much more visible? Thinking through this space of the stranded protagonist, Jaret Vadera introduced the idea of anabesis. The word comes from the Greek, meaning both to embark and to return. Baudelaire uses it to indicate a movement towards home of men who are lost, outlawed, and out of place. In his book Le Siècle, Alain Badiou has a chapter on anabesis. He regards it as an allegory of the 20th century drawing to a close, and of the drifting of a soul caught between two options, disciplined invention and uncertain drifting. I'll follow that with a clip from United Red Army, which is now on view at Power Plant. It'll drop you right into the sort of at the end of the action, but you'll see why, hopefully.
最後降りる時どういう基準で降ろしたんですかなんて言ったら、まあ向こうも冗談だと思いますけども、適当に選んだんだよっていうようなことは言われたんですね。日本が良くなったらまた皆さんに会えるかもしれませんつって、握手みんなになんか握手しながらなんか降りていきましたけれども、後からのはあまりなんか馴染まなかったというか、口もあまり聞かなかったもんですから、そのまま行きましたけれども。
Now remember, Danke. Tell me what is your name, because I have told you my name.
My name is number 20. When we establish People's Republic of Japan, I will tell you my original name.
So this is Dhaka Tower. Now after you have got your friends, you have forgotten me. I said now that you have got your friends, Okudaira, you have forgotten me. You have not called me up, or have you?
I have told it. I have received our comrades.
I said after you have received all your comrades, now you have forgotten to call me because it is no more necessary to call me. Is that right?
I don't understand what you mean.
Anyway, I hope you're alright now. It is not necessary to understand everything.
So, an appropriate coda, it is not necessary to understand everything. From a film this one, which is constructed entirely from the audio of the negotiations, and therefore, for most of the film, you have no images, a parallel to Eric's 27 years without images. I want to turn to one of Jaret's works that influenced me around this time as well. This from a series called Light, which appeared, I believe, in the Queen's International perhaps the year after Fatal Love, so the first time we'd worked together. And one of the things I remember, I hope Jaret will forgive if I misremember this slightly, is that, of course, I was certainly still in 2005 consumed by the idea of having to be very clear because the stakes were so high and we couldn't be misunderstood and we needed to collect evidence. And here was this series of paintings where I couldn't tell anything, although part of me thought, oh, this could be a taxi, because we were obsessed with taxis at that time from Visible Collective's work, since taxi drivers were such a focus of a lot of the politics of that time. And then this one could be a man. And so, of course, I went up to Jaret and at that point asked him to explain the images to me, explain both the composition and the layers within it. And he sort of half explained and half did not. And I was struck by that strategy of a refusal to explain, or a refusal to explain at times. Of course, this is standing not in an artist's talk, because we had been so focused on being clear. And then, of course, later on, United Red Army puts me in the path of a project where the image is completely missing, which is another kind of opacity. Another project of his, which I was very interested in at a certain point and was in dialogue with, was this one, based on the logic and illogic and results of search engine results and images. And one of the things that struck me different from the projects that I had been navigating is that I was often in search of an archive, and I would often not find the thing I was looking for. In fact, many of my projects come from not finding what I was looking for, especially not finding video, almost always. And here was Jaret's project, which was actually dealing with an overabundance of data, where you have so much data, you don't know what to make sense of it. And in some ways, I'll let Jaret explain the process, but as a result of using search engine results, he's produced these images, which are actually, in some ways, solid black. So this is a short text I wrote about this piece, just an excerpt. In Alan Moore's Watchmen, the jail vigilante, this is written in 2014 for Arts Review Asia. They asked each artist to choose another artist and write about them. So all that to say, it's before the film and all of that, 2014. In Alan Moore's Watchmen, the jail vigilante Rorschach is shown his namesake ink blot test by a psychiatrist trying to probe his demented mind. As Moore's anti-hero visualizes dead children, dismembered limbs, and a dog's split-open head, he tells his interrogator, with the smoothest of poker faces, that he sees flowers, birds, and beauty. Certain elements of Jaret Vadera's recent work play a similar game, but instead of the Rorschach test, he offers us search engines as a new form of memory, in which unemotional algorithms take over from the human mind, but prove just as adept at retraction, refraction, distortion, and deception. Vadera cites Stanislaw Lem's novel Solaris as an influence, but I think of other dreamscapes, where night visions are rendered nightmares much faster than they are in Tarkovsky's film of the book. The murderous superheroes of Alan Moore, or the conniving dream players of Neil Gaiman's plots. The search engine games also seem akin to the moment in Michael Haneke's Funny Games, 97 version, in which one of the protagonists picks up a remote control and rewinds the film in order to prevent his colleague from being shot. A person may choose what to remember and what to forget, but Palo Alto databases ensure you never escape.
Some Hindus had brought an elephant for exhibition and placed it in a dark house. Crowds of people were going into that dark place to see the beast, finding that ocular inspection was impossible. Each visitor felt it with his palm in the darkness. The palm of one fell on the trunk. "This creature is like a waterspout," he said. The hand of another landed on the elephant's ear. To him, the beast was evidently like a fan. Another rubbed against its leg. I found the elephant's shape is like a pillar, he said. Another laid his hand on its back. Certainly this elephant was like a throne, he said. The sensual eye is just like the palm of the hand. The palm has not the means of covering the whole of the beast. The eye of the sea is one thing and the form another. Let the form go, and gaze with the eye of the sea. Day and night, fawn flakes are flung from the sea. Of amazing! You behold the form, but not the sea. We are like boats, dashing together. Our eyes are darkened, yet we are in clear water.
So that's a short excerpt from a piece by Jaret Vadera. There are many things to talk about within that piece, but just to throw out, it's a computer translation that's trying to read or trying to render that story, of course, the story of the blind and the elephant. But the computer voice is also a faux Indian voice, or maybe it's accurate to somebody. And so it brings up themes of translation and not just invisibility, which is also there, but also the role of technology in rendering certain things in certain voices. And we'll talk about that more afterwards. I want to segue from that, which is of course about the blind men trying to figure out the shape of the elephant, to a short clip from Tripoli Cancelled, which was in the last season at Power Plant, the chapter that just ended. And it's a man who lives in an airport, and as I mentioned earlier, some of my friends thought he was a communist in exile, which wasn't really my thought, but then once you've done 4 films in a series about the revolutionary left, it's inevitable that every other film will be within that filter. It's about many things maybe, but it's about also loneliness. And this is a clip, maybe that's about loneliness within some idea of the family unit.
Operator, hello? Please connect me to 812359. Country code, it is 88 and then 02 for the city. Yes? Yes. There is ringing but no answer? Please keep trying. No, I am sure this is the correct number, quite sure. Someone will be at home. My wife. She is always home. She's waiting for my call. Thank you. I will try again next week.
Earlier during the introduction, someone referred to Tripoli Cancelled as, I think it was Lauren, my first fiction film. And it is fiction, it's true, but there's little bits and pieces of real life in there. So the phone number he tries to call is actually the phone number I grew up with in Bangladesh. So 8802812359, a digit form that doesn't exist anymore because of mobile phones. And then my father was actually stuck in this airport for 9 days, although in the film the man has been living there for 10 years. So slight inflation on my part. I won't go too much into it, of course, because it's a short clip, but of course the film is also about a certain kind of bruised and lost masculinity that's trying to find itself within a world that doesn't make sense anymore, within which the male role within the family unit is suddenly unmoored from certainties. And that piece of dialogue where he says, my wife is always at home waiting for my call, harkens back to a structure that maybe once gave some sort of sense to the nuclear unit, family unit, although of course in some ways it didn't. I'll end with this because it's a good way to come back to the idea of friendships and collaborations and little things that come back and forth over long-term correspondence and conversation. This is a project that it's complicated to explain in brief, but very briefly. It's about my great uncle, who was a Bengali writer from the 1920s and 30s, as was happening with a lot of, at that time it's of course Indian authors. The place that they were getting scholarship in the 1920s was Germany, because Germany was on a very serious charm offensive to bring over Indian scholars, as well as Germany had a specific interest in Aryan studies, for which they found Indian academics to be willing and enthusiastic partners. The back history of this, if anyone is interested, read up on it, is in a very good book by Chris Manjapra called Entanglements, German and Indian, I forget, before the Second World War. Obviously, the mention of the Second World War tells you why this is a problem, because the project of Aryan studies and bringing Indians over for scholarship is happening in the backdrop of what's about to be the arrival of National Socialism, Hitler's party, and then, of course, the Second World War and the Holocaust. My great uncle, having done his PhD in Germany, there's that wormhole phrase again, goes into his own wormhole, which is that he gets indoctrinated in a certain way of thinking about the German project as also being a project to liberate India from British rule, and then writes a series of essays about how Germany is going to liberate India from British rule, and therefore it's the job of Indian nationalists to support the German army. Which is, he's not alone in this thinking. There's a lot of people subscribe, or not a lot, but a strand that subscribes to this, led by Subhash Chandra Bose, which is in the project a little bit. So I was talking to Jaret about it as I was struggling about this project, and one of the things I was struggling about is whether to do the project at all, because his work hasn't really been translated. The essays in question were only in Bengali. I seem to have been the only one in the family who had found them. I mean, others perhaps had and then had sort of ignored them. And then I talked to Jaret about the obligation to continue with the project or just let it lie. And then I was talking about, you know, my great uncle being someone who lived in Germany, almost married someone German in the 1930s, and here, meanwhile, is somehow unable to see the footsteps of the Holocaust arriving. And at some point, Jaret kind of did a triangular cross connection and said, well, this is, we're all part of this. This is the flaw in the algorithm of cosmopolitanism. And I think it might have been Jaret's own phrase, or maybe taken also from a reading. And that became the title of the project, Volume 11, Flaw in the Algorithm of Cosmopolitanism. So I think that's a good place for me to stop, to also reflect on the fact that when each of us makes work, whatever form we make the work in, it's probably quite legible what our influences are while we're in school or within a community of artists, let's say a collective. But when we become, and as happens for many of us, atomized individuals within a city, perhaps belonging to a community but not living within community, perhaps belonging to a collective but not being able to keep the collective together, because as I said, everybody scatters. Certainly in a city like New York, the constant is that people leave. Within that, my constant has been people who are friends with whom I'm in dialogue with, and who keep resurfacing in the work in invisible and visible influences, which perhaps is the perfect place to end the talk and transition to a conversation with Jaret. This is a bit serious, the desk.
Yeah, it's a bit serious. This, by the way, is the room, I guess 25 years ago that I did my interview to come to OCA. It was then called OCA, 94, I think it was.
There were not these bleacher seats.
No, there weren't. There were just, there was a nervous, anxious high school student who wanted to come to what seemed like impossible, magical place. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, Naeem, for opening up the space to talk about my work. That was actually very, very nice. I'm very flattered. And I want to get into the work and some of your ideas a little bit more, but I want to also just say that I'm touched, and I think that it's a very important thing to think about communities, to think about kinship, to think about affinities, to think about influencing each other within a certain group at a certain time in a particular space. And I know as you have skyrocketed in many ways throughout the world, nominated for the Turner Prize, in Documenta, in the Venice Biennale, all while doing his PhD and making me feel very unproductive.
That's not true.
But I feel that, there's a way that the art market, the art world, isolates you and creates this idea of the genius artist, or the artist, or in film, the auteur. And I think that it's, as I know you, you've always been a person who has been very, very active in community organizing, cultural organizing. You've been instrumental in helping move other artists' careers around, and you've been part of a dialogue. You were part of Visible Collective. You're actively engaged with the South Asian community in Brooklyn, in New York. So I think that's something just to note. We're living in a hyper-capital, late capitalist world that likes to make artists into superstars, kind of turn them into monuments or turn them into one-offs.
There's a sentence at the end of an interview we did for Asian American Literary Review, where somebody said, one of us said, the nature of the market within which we live, which we haven't been able to think of our way out of. Frederick Jameson's line, we can imagine the end of the world, but we can't yet imagine the end of capitalism. We haven't yet, although of course many are trying. One of the ways it works, of course, is that you're always given the feeling, and the art market, art world excels at this, the idea that you're in competition with each other. And to move ahead, somebody has to be left behind. And the clearest way we saw it with the Fatal Love show, and maybe it's easier to talk about Fatal Love because it's 22 artists who are broadly South Asian, so broadly it's possible to sort of be aware of each other, is that things did start happening for some more, which had maybe to do with form, situation, whatever, all the combinations. But one of the ways I experienced it immediately was that in the 10 years after 2005, even if we were friends or in conversation, we just didn't see each other. People just, and I mentioned Visible Collective. A lot of them also left New York because they couldn't afford to live in a city like New York anymore. So that's also the ways that things started coming apart, where you're in dialogue, you're making the work, and suddenly you're looking at left and right, and they're also looking left and right because they're somewhere. I mean, I think it's almost like a very technical conversation, but the dissipation of people from cities is part of what's affecting work that's being made.
Right, and you're somebody who lives between Brooklyn and Dhaka, and you say you don't like flying, but
I hate flying.
You are one of the most well-traveled people that I know. You're always going from city to city. And so from one city to another, it's a different context, it's a different language, it's a different history, different things are at stake. So I'm going to try to circumvent the normal question, which is, who is your audience? and ask it in a slightly skewed way. Is there an ideal viewer that you're thinking about with your work? And the second part of that question would be, how does your work function in different ways? Like, and so this is the key word, is function in different communities.
I mean, the question could just easily be asked of you as well, so hopefully you'll answer it as well, and also for everybody here, I'm sure they're thinking about it as they're making work. You know, I always think that ideal situation, maybe rather than individual, is where somebody has the time and the space to obsess with the work as much as I did, right? I feel that there's a universe of things that I've been thinking about, and of course very little of that is going to make it into the work within its time span, either as a film or as an installation in the case of Volume 11. But I always have this idea, and it's of course an idea from hyperlink culture, if we can still use that word now, which was the idea that you read something. I mean, in the very early days of the internet, that was the basic selling point, that you go on a page and you go off and do the rest of the research yourself. Because almost always hyperlinks would end, you know, everything didn't lead to something else as it does today. There were many, you know, Wikipedia wasn't what it was, for example. So I always have this idea that people will approach the work and then go off and do their own research, right? I wouldn't want anyone to take my word, or even Chris Manjapra's word, although that's a dense book, on how to understand, let's say, the Indian experience of German seduction before the Second World War, right? I have my view, but my view is wrapped up in, I think, trying to clear my great uncle somehow of the obvious charge that can attach to him for having been a sympathizer to the German army, right? And having been blind to the Holocaust, let's say. But I can't force that on someone either, right? Because I'm a suspect teller, because it's my great uncle, right? And so then I always think, okay, so people will look at this work and then they'll go read books. They'll read this book and that book. And there's no way to know if that's happening. Right? I mean, I have this fantasy in my head that one day I'm going to get an email from someone that, like, two years later has dug deeper and found things that I haven't found. And I'm sure they have, but people don't necessarily loop back unless you're somehow tweeting about it right this moment and there's an instant option. So I guess an ideal situation is where people have a lot of time to sit with the work. And I would say that even though the museum, the contemporary art space, is a very flawed space in some ways to show durational films. You know, as Lauren mentioned, it was an unusual structure to have not only the films, but to have start and finish times, because that's not how people approach the museum. They don't think, I need to find out the start time. And often there isn't a start time. So there are many issues, and people walk in and walk out, all of that. And you know, you're not in all of that. But still, I found in my experience, at least as the world works today, if it's online, that's one thing, but otherwise I find the museum to be a physical space that at least holds out the possibility that there'll be that one person who'll be able to stay all day and watch it again, or go do something else and then come back, or go read the thing on the wall, although the footnotes don't necessarily explain, they just sort of hopefully scramble your brain, but then make you think about more things to look at. So an ideal situation, I guess, is the messy situation of the museum. Having said that, I think in 5 years from now, we're not going to be living in a world of media, anything like what we live in today. You know, with the whole, everything that's happening with micro cinema and streaming, all of that, which is about to, I don't know where it's going, but that's going to change everything.
And then, so the second question is kind of a loaded question, right?
By the way, sorry, I realized I sound like a tech booster when I said that.
Yeah.
I'm not a tech utopian at all, right? I'm not saying it's going to be wonderful and we're all going to be free. No, but I'm just saying things are going to change, that's all.
Well, part of what I'm asking, which is beneath the surface of the question of how does your work function, is that you operate within documentary filmmaker circles. Mm-hmm. You operate within artist circles. You operate within activist circles. You operate within global left circles, global south circles, mm-hmm. New York artists of color circles. So I'm just. And then you have, you know, the critique that you levied before was that maybe you don't engage with class in the same sort of way. So how do you know, when you go to Bangladesh, when you go, like, the stakes are higher and they're different when you show something. You know, you come to New York, you have to probably explain a little bit more. When you're showing your work in Europe, maybe you it shifts, and the leftists get really excited from like in that context, but don't know the specificity. So that's in some ways what I'm asking about how your work functions in these different spaces.
My God, that's such a huge question.
Yeah.
I don't even know where to start. Okay, let me fixate on the last thing you said, which is about leftists. So since Young Man Was, the work has visibly been about left politics, visibly 1970s, very specifically the part of left politics that wasn't about parliamentary elections or winning elections, but was about insurgency, was about taking power by force, based on the logic that we'll never be allowed to come to power through elections. Not untrue, and of course everybody pointed to Salvador Allende as the example of see what happens when you try to do elections. So very specifically the sort of forces that were very actively involved in armed overthrow of the state, right? Which is of interest to a lot of people for many reasons, including just the pure aesthetic of that movement, including the fact that many of the people in this movement died very dramatically. Therefore, they didn't live and grow old so as to show whether they could actually succeed or fail. Right? One of the things with somebody like Joschka Fischer, who is in Afsan's Long Day, which we'll show next season, is that he lived, he survived, he was in the German Greens, he eventually got to power, and then he became, for the left, a kind of embarrassment because he was part of the coalition of the willing during the Iraq War. So then you actually have an actually existing leftist politician who actually gets to power, and this is what he does, and then you have to deal with that, right? With many of these people that I work with, they don't get to power, they don't survive, right? So there's a lot of interest for that reason. And I think those people who are interested in that, leaving aside the question of violence for now, are fundamentally interested in the idea of seizing power somehow, not necessarily through elections, question mark. And I think for them, the films and the projects are discombobulating because at the end of the day, even though I have some love for the movements, I have tremendous amounts of questions about all the ways the movements went wrong. And I use the words failing and flailing masculinity as sort of like the underpinning of some of these movements that also very easily slides into, or maybe it's part of, this messiah complex, right? Which then grafts onto a teleology of it's inevitable because it's written, which I always see as somewhat similar to, of course, religious inevitability here and in the afterlife. So all of that makes, I think, certain left political groups uncomfortable. And then I find that the left critique that I get in, let's say, Bangladesh is very different from the left critique I get in Europe, because there's also this strange thing happening, which is, of course, who you embody when you go there, and when you're maybe one of the few artists of color in a European city which doesn't know how to reach their own artists of color, so they're importing us, which is itself problematic. And then they don't know what to do with you. They feel they need to treat you with kid gloves also, right? Just one experience. So Afsan's Long Day has a German section. It's the only section where in Germany, I've been hammered with questions and all the points that I'm wrong on, which I could very well be, but I've thought, but I could be wrong on the Bangladesh material as well. But they're presuming, we can't. So there's this also like sort of having to touch you gingerly when it comes to your own quote unquote material, which is sort of a, it's a liberal position, which is also, it's patronizing, obviously. If you can question me on the German material, you should hammer me on the Bangladesh material as well, and people don't. And just to go back to something I said very quickly, it's worth talking about this question of circulating, that certainly since 2001, there is this strand. I've experienced it most clearly in Europe, but in a lot of other places as well, where a museum hasn't figured out how to speak to or reach out to their own communities. And so the artist of color is being brought in from another country and then is somehow being expected to speak to that community, somehow even bring that community in. Why should a Turkish-German generation have any interest in hearing me in particular because I'm somehow read as Muslim, right? So that's a whole other thing about circulation of works, that sometimes the work is deployed to form some sort of civic work, which the work cannot do, and some sort of bringing people into the museum, which is a terribly unfair burden to place on you for a city you don't live in. So that was my sort of segue / I just wanted to say that.
Yeah,
about the European Museum, I guess.
Well, I think that also can hold true in North America as well. And another place that I see that happening is not just in curatorial discovering of artists of color or artists from around the world, it happens through education departments. And there's some kind of like gray area when it comes to community outreach and education departments, which has seen the invitations to a lot of artists from historically underrepresented communities, and they use that as a way to say, hey, look, we're doing something that will engage with the people in the neighborhood where our museum is, as opposed to all the other curatorial content, which is very focused on a very small sliver of cultural production in the world.
Yeah, I think also you have to bring class into the conversation, as in whether artists they're bringing in or circulating, what's the class composition of that audience and who are they supposed to represent? Because there's that, that gets hidden in this conversation in some ways, and I'm always into bringing that forward. It's at least certainly in the American context, class is invisibilized by race sometimes, not always, right?
Class is invisibilized by race. Oh, right. Okay.
That was maybe too simple.
Yeah.
It's much more complex than that, but that's just the first thing that occurred to me. Or it feels like class doesn't have to be talked about because you've now got racial representation somehow, right?
Right, and this is where intersectionality comes in.
I mean, I'm interested in why aren't these institutions wanting to speak to the, have a dialogue about the white working class? Like that's just sort of invisibilized in all of this also.
Well, yeah, this is the problem that I see happen again and again. It's when somebody brings up an issue of race, somebody brings up the issue of class, as if they're not intersecting in these different layered ways, or the opposite. And so I think that that's one of the gifts that intersectionality allows us to do. It gives us a frame to look at the multiple layers of privilege, oppression, and historical, sometimes violence that happens in a given moment at a specific time. And so how are your films received in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, in your other home?
Yeah. I'm just trying to think how they have to summarize how they receive. It's very varied. They're often not shown for a month, as might happen here. They're often shown because it is still a structure often where it can't be a month-long installation. You have to film, so you show it once a day, and that's it. I think the question, of course people get something out of them, but the question I get most frequently, of course, is why the language is English, right? Because the language in almost all the films is in English, except early documentaries pre-2004. And that has to do with many things, including the fact that after living in America for 20 years, I've started dreaming in English, whether fortunately or unfortunately. So then scripts come out in English somehow, or not somehow, they come out. So that's, I think, a place of friction inside Bangladesh. But at the same time, there's a new generation coming up that's starting to forget Bengali. So I'm sometimes in this weird position of actually pushing back about the expansion of English everywhere, whereas anyone can look at me and say, yeah, but your films have a lot of... So I'm in this contradictory, confused place. I would say the other thing is that some of the things that can be taken quite lightly here, because it's about the form, not about the material, not about the who did what, isn't so light in Bangladesh. Who is the first person to declare that on this date, or is a life and death question? So those things sometimes when I am a little humorous about it, I would say doesn't go over so well. But hasn't resulted in any major controversy to date, which I think shows something about the circulation of anything that's seen as art practice, as opposed to being in a cinema hall. They're just not seen by enough people for controversy to happen.
Right.
So far.
Well, another way that I could also keep going back to the function, and I don't mean to reduce artwork in terms of what does it do, because that's not always your responsibility, or it might not necessarily be
your original intent even.
Original intent, but I do think that there is a level of accountability and a sort of understanding that an artist has to have over what they do and how it works in the world. And two of the worlds that you operate within, right, are like art and politics, right? And so, the history of political art or socially engaged art often relates to, or the debates are between like something that's aestheticized and something that is pragmatic, right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying.
Right.
But you seem to do both at the same time, and I'm just curious. It's I feel like the leftists that are looking for a new way out might look at your work and say, okay, where is this leading me? People who are there's just many different ways that your work can be read or not sort of fit into different categories in ways that are easy. Yeah.
I think it's okay, this applies, I think, to all of us because depending on levels of engagement with media, we all, as makers of anything, live kind of two or multiple lives. One is the work we're making and showing, wherever we're showing, and that's the work. And you could choose to be a very taciturn artist who doesn't give artist talks and doesn't explain their work. That could be a mode, so that the work speaks for itself, right? And I've tried that also, and that sometimes hasn't gone so well because the talk is part of the structure, right? So that's one. But the other thing is that parallel to that, most of us now live within, I hate this term, social media in all its forms, right? Which is and I'm told all the time that, I'm really not on Instagram and I'm not on Twitter at all, so I'm actually way behind on social media. There are many ways that people can exist, right? And I think all of that gets collapsed together into the reception of the work, even if those are just you doing whatever you wanted to do anyway, but that gets seen as ways to understand and read your work. So here's an example. I'm not really on any of those other platforms, but I'm on Facebook, and I post things as soon as I read them. I like to share. It's kind of my way of catharsis. Oh, I read this really terrible or good thing that happened, most of the time terrible, but let me share, and then we'll somehow feel strong by getting upset together. To have somebody write WTF underneath somehow is like, okay, so we're all sane because we're all upset at this. But that then collapses into the understanding of you, right? And a really sharp example is when the Iranian Green Revolution happened in 2007 or 9 with the election that was stolen, and it was, where is my vote? I was posting a lot about Iran, quite a lot, right? And then I got a message from somebody saying, oh, would you like to write about Iran? At which point I said, I'm not from Iran and I've never been there. They're like, oh, I thought you were Iranian from the post, right? I mean, it's a crude example, but it's a way that people also, and you don't have to be a person of color to experience this thing, what you're sharing on social media becomes part of what you're understood to be. And I think when you say, I'm in politics or the work is somehow political, I think you're actually, like everybody, seeing all of that stuff with the work. Sometimes the work is trying to be much quieter, but it doesn't work because all of that is also happening. So Invisible Man, the first video I showed, we were also interested in old clips of horror films. That's what all those clips are. We just wanted to play with them. And then the Oregon preacher, the Oregon imam, became the backdrop, right? But because it's a 4 or 5 minute video, who's going to allow you to show just that? So almost always the invitations were to show that and talk. And once we're talking, all of the mystery we might want, will people really, is taken away. So I think it's also part of the thing that, what would happen if we just allowed the work to speak for itself? Speaking of the circulation of work, that actually is not, I'm sure there are some people who are totally not on social media and have no media footprint, and therefore their private lives or their political musings are completely unknown, but many people are not. And I think that also gets put together. So I was very involved in Gulf Labor, which was a coalition in New York, still exists, specifically working on a boycott of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, a proposed museum in Abu Dhabi, over the treatment of workers. For me, at least, it was very clear that that was a political activism project with a very specific goal. I wasn't trying to make art, right? That's not the case for every member, because some members, political agitation is their art form, actually, right? But Gulf Labor being out there then gets conflated back into the work, right? And I'm not complaining necessarily, that's what you take on, but I think like the work living in splendid isolation doesn't happen for anybody now, right? And that's something to contend with. Sometimes when you want the work to be quiet, like sometimes if you want the work to not be a solution, not always do you want to provide a toolbox, a Swiss Army knife that's going to help solve things, because like I said, it's a huge burden to put on work. right?
Right.
But sometimes because of the way we also exist everywhere else, it's assumed that you're also making the work to find a solution.
Right.
I mean, I'm certainly trying to think with everybody and learn from everybody, but I think the solution is far beyond the capacity of
and
any work.
complicate the idea of the solution. Maybe that's part of the utopian challenges that all of these movements have faced. But I think Yael wants to
I'm going
open it
to
up.
invite others to join your conversation at this time as well. So, Richard, I'm going to solicit you because Minsuk's going to help. So are there questions or people who would like to enter this conversation? We can let Naeem and Jaret continue as well, but you could ask questions of both as well. Any, yes?
Or comments that we can riff on.
Yes.
I'd love to hear Jaret riff.
I'm not sure if this kind of continues on your conversation, but just wanted to comment on the clip that you showed from the current film.
United Red Army.
United Red Army. I thought it was like really unfortunate that you showed that film, like that clip, because isolating it almost terrorized it, right? Because like out of the whole film, and I don't want to ruin it for everybody because it's so beautiful, it's kind of like the denouement, and it's only like 2%, 3% of the whole film, but in a way for me it made it, right? Like you're building up this tension and then all of a sudden there's this moment, completely unexpected, a moment of like tenderness, a tragic comic kind of moment, almost like a poetic moment. And now that you've kind of isolated it, I want to ask you, can you imagine a version of the same film without this clip? And what would that be?
Without that clip?
Without that clip.
Well, I don't know if I can quite answer that question. That's a really tough one. I can't. It is the denouement, as you say. But I'll say one thing, which is the decision to show that clip or even to make that clip was today. I came, I was in the exhibition space, I came out, Lauren kindly gave me a room, high-speed internet, and I thought, let me show that clip, right? And without having a clear understanding of who will be here at OCAD, and also having a sense of, okay, OCAD is Jaret's school, so to me it's like a little extra also as a space to show. And I also knew that I was going to be showing Jaret's Blind Elephant video, so I had other thoughts in my head of, oh, I have to make a connection. You know, I was a little bit burdened in a willing way of trying to make connections between my work and Jaret's work, which normally is there, but I don't usually have to speak it out loud, right? That's why I said that the artist talk is, you know, it is, of course, a very good way to start having conversations about the work, but it also sometimes puts a burden on the work, because sometimes you don't want to explain, right? So I chose that clip, and as you were speaking, I was thinking, I knew I should have used a different clip, because I also went back and forth between that clip and another one, which had more video, like a little bit more relief, the Walter Cronkite clip, and I thought, no, that's too, you know, then you have the Hollywood actress. So perhaps I made the wrong decision, or at least the strange decision for this situation. But I do want to say something about just, you know, showing clips from any of these films is tricky. The only one I showed entirely is Invisible Man, because that's 4 minutes, right? Everything else is a clip. United Red Army as a film in 2011 came out of specifically an invitation to make work for a museum context, not a film festival, right? I was free because unlike a film festival, the museum isn't asking to finalize, that you submit the final print before they even make a decision, right? And that's partially because, look, let's be real about the economics. A film festival has a theater that they rent and they can only show one film that evening, so it has to be all or nothing, which is why film festivals now, including TIFF, are kind of overrun by Wes Anderson type situations. Certainly in New York, that's the case, where you think, does Wes Anderson really need to be the opener for New York Film Festival? I can think of 500 films made by independent filmmakers that year, right? But it's the way, that's why Martin Scorsese opens things. That's my pet peeve. So we understand the economics of why film festivals have to be so incredibly selective, a Darwinian evolution, and museums can be whatever, because museums have 40 artists, 10 video in rooms. The stakes are different, right? They can put 10 films and there's no pressure. there's a different freedom for us because the film is looping. So you don't know when people are going to walk in or walk out. So that film was the perfect thing for me because I also didn't know when people would walk in and walk out. But in terms of structure, and maybe coming back to the question of why we show in museums, it was structured in that way that if you watch it all the way through, a revelation comes that won't come if you walk in 10 minutes to the end. And I suppose what you're actually pointing out is by, and I hope people won't hold this against it, but I've kind of ruined the ending because I've given away the ending, which builds up, right? The homoerotic tension between the two men only has a tenderness because you've traveled with them down this journey of mistranslation. The Japanese man's English actually improves over the 5 days, whereas it's very halting on the first day. That's a journey you needed to sit through. And here I've short circuit. So maybe it also says something about whether we can, I know I haven't done it yet, but whether we can rethink the artist talk into other formats also.
Oh no, I was just saying I agree. Love this conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I also think it's a prompt for people to see the full film. And I just watched the full film again today. I've seen it a few times, maybe 3 or 4 times. It's one of my favorite pieces. It really marries archival footage with autobiographical moments, with the kind of poetry and absence, and the translation, the mistranslations, and the tension can only be experienced over time between these two sort of invisible speakers that are negotiating this hostage situation.
Right. I mean, ideally, without knowing what you're going to walk into. So an ideal situation would be there's no label, you don't know who it is. You walk in and the first 5 minutes you go, oh my God, this is so boring. Why is this person speaking so slowly? And then about 10, 12 minutes in, there's a WTF moment, which hopefully if you stay. But we also live in a world where works don't arrive to us without all the, so that's also like something I think about, that works don't arrive in unknown ways anymore. Or not as much.
They're super contextualized,
yeah.
or over
yeah. And you can Google almost anything, so that's just something to think about.
Sorry, you spoke about museums being able to cope with, video pieces and films by having them in different rooms. But there's a huge pressure on the visitor. You arrive and you sit down and think, this is really interesting. I want to get engaged and watch it. And we did actually sit through Tripoli Calling. I think it's an hour and a half long. But it's brilliant. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was fantastic. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, what am I missing in the rest of the museum? Is there another hour and a half long film? How am I going to do this? I've only got 4 hours to visit this particular place. So I agree entirely with the points you made earlier about curation, and it is a huge challenge for museums. Yeah. The other thing is that the production values of Tripoli Calling, I thought, were really amazing. Was it funded as part of a film festival, or how? There was like an actor, and obviously the running time and just the way it was shot was fantastic. So some comments on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, so it's very, I'll come back to the museum thing also, because I think it's an interesting thing to think through together. It was many things happening. One was that Documenta was going to be in Athens and Germany, Athens and Kassel, and I had actually proposed 2 meetings, the 3-channel film, as a 2-chapter film. Part 1 would be in Athens, part 2 would be in Kassel. It's a sort of idea that sounds great on paper. Oh, people will have to go to both cities. In practice, it's actually completely lunatic, because nobody was doing that. Nobody was going to both cities, and the idea that they'll watch part 1 and then come and see part 2 like 3 months later and remember is just, it just wouldn't have happened. So thankfully, this film intervened to force those 2 parts to be one film. Basically, I was in Athens researching that other film, right? And then my father had really been stranded in that airport in '77, and that airport doesn't work anymore, right? It's barbed wired and everything. And John Akomfra had just filmed The Airport, his film, in that same space. His is a 3-channel film with, gorillas and astronauts and various other beautiful, wondrous things. And he finished filming the day I arrived, and then I saw him, and he mentioned shooting, and the first thing I said is, how did you get permission? And he basically gave me the idea of how to get permission in an unconventional way, right? Not by because there was no normal structure also given what Greece was going through in 2016. So that's how it started. And I think I'm never going to get that situation again, which is that it was really free because there was no objective, there was no invitation, there just happened to be a Greek crew that was in between shooting ads and had the best cameras and were eager to work on something, right? So that's how we started. And then, document, Adam Simcik found out about it and, asked to see a clip, and then he said, oh, this has to be. So that's how, I haven't been in that situation since, or especially not since, where you're working on something without an end goal. It's quite liberating, and it's also very hard to do that now, because now everything, there's this whole structure. About museums, the thing I wanted to say is Rasha Salti, that's the person I was going to mention. She was the co-curator of the Sharjah Biennial 2011, where the Hijack film premiered. She's someone who came from Film Festival World, curated that biennial, then asked 3 of us why we did films in museums, why on a loop. Why not from beginning to end? And each of us gave an answer that I think we made up in response to the situation, which, I gave a very 90s answer, which is that, I want audiences to come in at different times and have their own story, which is straight out of CD-ROM idea of the 90s, where you choose your own door. And okay, that answer makes sense. It's also in some ways responding to the situation, and also some ways, you believe it if you want to. You don't, you have to accept the fiction that audiences will do that. Russia curates film festivals mostly. So people are still trying to work this out. And then we're having this conversation at a time when a large part of the planet now watches things in the form of binging, in the form of stopping whenever they want, in the form of not watching it at any schedule, I can watch it whenever, and watching it alone, and watching it on small scale. So we're in that world as well. And so we're all, I think, trying to figure it out and haven't figured it out. I don't know if, Jaret, you wanted to add to that?
No, and I think we're also in a time where there's a lot of immediate gratification in terms of watching something. It's like junk food for the mind, like a lot of the things we watch on, or binge. The whole ethos behind getting people to binge is an addictive model, right? And so, yeah.
I just want to say that when we talk about this, especially in this context, when we talk about binging, when we talk about Netflix, when we talk about streaming, I think it's very easy to feel that we are just condemning it, because that's the default position. Even the word binge is, of course, negative. Binge, junk food, etc. But I think that, to me, is less interesting than thinking about the fact that it's happening no matter what. People's viewing patterns are permanently changed. My viewing patterns are permanently changed. Everybody's, right? We're all swimming within this. So then what happens, right? What next?
I think it was Jaret who mentioned that you in Brooklyn have been involved a little bit with some of the South Asian communities. So just the neighborhood I'm familiar. Was it Jaret who mentioned that? Yeah. Yeah, good. Anyway, and maybe, but event. I just there's a neighborhood I'm familiar with. I'd like you to reflect on, perhaps, I've spent quite a bit of time there, which is in Kensington, right? Which has a large Bangladesh community. And it's a couple interesting things about it. One is that they've managed to keep gentrification kind of out of the community. But it was also the target, sort of one of the ground central targets after 9/11 for, the FBI and New York City police and so on. All that. But since then, I've been dealing with a sort of finding very interesting encounters there, outside of that question, right? And of course my way, because I just try to engage people, shopkeepers, in all kind of interesting discussions about public provision of things that they pay a lot of money for instead of, the private forms and things like that. And I'm just wondering from your own experience how, and whether there's been a way to open up around the complexity and whether you're using your art, that's part of I can see the conversations that are going on there that are dealing with questions of class, capitalism, the transformations in New York City. And I'd just be curious to see if you've have any reflections there.
I think I really want to hear Jared's answer or reflections on this, because you've also lived in Toronto, New York, and now are experiencing Cornell, three radically different situations.
Yeah, I think that the Kensington, I live in Flatbush, and so there's a lot of challenges that we're facing in the U.S. right now. And when we were talking about fatal love earlier, we were dealing with the post 9/11 hysteria. People were just, being rounded up. People were being put on lists. People were leaving en masse. It was a different situation. Right now, one of the most pressing situations is ICE and what's happening with roundups of people. And in my community, in Flatbush, there are a lot of actions being taken, what to do, how to prepare, how to alert people about ICE's presence, because they just kind of go in and terrorize different communities in Brooklyn and in Queens in particular. And so I don't think, one of the communities that we operate within, the South Asian community in New York, is full of activists, organizers, lawyers, and then there's artists as well, and we kind of all overlap. And I think some of the best work doesn't necessarily happen within the art sphere, and sometimes it's okay to just say, okay, I'm making art for this context, and actually I need to go and do something very hands-on and very direct with this community organization. So I don't feel the need to pull social action into art. I like to keep them sometimes separate and not feel the burden to aestheticize something that's very urgent or make something urgent that's very aesthetic. So to keep that code switching available as an option, I think is important. I think you do it too. You've been part of a number of different, Gulf Labor was something, the 52 Weeks project. You've been
that you were in.
That I was in, yes, and I had a piece at A Space that was from that project. But you've also been part of a number of letters that have been written. You were part of 16 Beaver. You were part of a number of different communities as well that weren't necessarily looking at aesthetics in the same sort of 1, 2, 3 white box gallery way.
But I think this is a very New York specific thing. I think the one thing to add to that is I do feel that between 2002 and about 2007-8, which is basically the two Bush administrations, there was a way that a lot of, I don't know what the word is, mainstream, normal, institutional spaces just would not touch this topic. The New York Times went for almost 3 years without writing anything about this, and there were certain things that were just off limit. To question, for example, the validity of torture as a technique or as a method or as morality, anything like that, was actually off the table for a good 2 to 3 to 4 years. And then it started shifting, of course, and then the boomerang and all of that happens, where now liberal discourse very freely, of course, condemns torture, but it didn't. And I feel that my experience was, it's not, artists don't have a special ability or special mission or anything, but I think precisely because there's both opacity in the language and a certain marginality in the way the work circulates, right? Mm-hmm. Even though you gave examples of the peak circulation, but there's lots of small ways it circulates. There was a way that we could operate 2003-04 kind of in the shadows among like-minded people. We didn't imagine writing an editorial in the New York Times because we knew it wouldn't get published. So we didn't put that energy into that. So I do feel that, the Queens Museum, Queens Museum is off the track for New York as well, right? It's in Queens, it's hard to get to, the subway doesn't directly lead there. That's enough of a killer for a lot of people in Manhattan. So it was outside of certain, that's why Tom Finkelpearl could program Emily Jassier, and she could do a project about the Palestinian pavilion at the World Fair in '65 in New York, I think even before 2001 or right afterwards, because it was also not a Manhattan museum. So it could operate a little bit, things could be done, and you might say, okay, what's the point of showing in a marginal space? But marginal spaces are where you try the conversation out and build alliances and community. And then I think gradually what's happened is more and more of these people have moved to the center in some ways, or the center has come to us, and I think other people have taken it on. Like I do think that the New York Times is still a terrible newspaper in all sorts of ways, but it does cover things now that were unthinkable in 2003, 4. You know, when Trevor Paglen started making work about the torture camps, I thought, yes, good. We need, you know, I want to see a white artist make work about this, not just people who seem to be from the affected community, which is a whole other conversation also.
We have a question over there, and then time for one more if there's a very pressing question that anybody has. So put your hand up if you do, but there's one over there.
I'm struck by and appreciate how many times you've alluded to or explicitly named some of the problematic dynamics of working with art institutions. And I wonder, as someone who's clearly, you know, from the start of your talk kind of been pointing them out, I wonder what kinds of gestures you think you've been making to kind of push back against whether, you know, in some of the scenario, you've named quite a lot of different ways in which, you know, whether it's like bringing in the artist to connect with a community and so on. I'm curious to know, like, I suspect there are kinds of many gestures or actions you've been contemplating or working through, and I was just curious to hear if you wanted to share some of them.
I can share one thing that I've tried, not successfully, but I think it becomes the beginning of what might work in the future. Certainly the experience of being invited to a city, and this is not an America, Europe, Middle East, more, it's about a city where you don't have a pre-existing community, right? And no possibility of one either, for whatever reason. You know, and then the invitation is also 4 days, right? 4 days of housing will be covered. You know that you won't be able to either, right? The invitation is too short. Those are the ones that worry me the most, right? To be landed in the middle of Zurich and be utterly unconnected to whatever, you know, there's not enough time. So the way I've tried to push back sometimes is I've now suggested it 3 times, that I suggested a joint show. So instead of a show, then 2 people, and I've suggested someone from that city. Or I've suggested somebody from somewhere else. You know, I'm very aware of my male privilege, so I've also very much insisted not to be paired with another male artist if possible. And what I've found so far is that, you know, that hasn't gone over so well so far, because you're also essentially taking over the curating role a little bit, right? You're suggesting that, oh, this should actually be a group show, and here's somebody. And I also understand why there's a pushback. Maybe there's a pre-existing script that's based on fundraising that will happen based on checkboxes. But I've tried. I haven't fully succeeded. I haven't succeeded so far. The other thing is that I've tried to push towards sometimes having a print publication instead of a work on a wall, because it strikes me that the print publication can circulate far beyond the exhibition duration and can circulate inexpensively, right? That's been a little more successful so far. What else? Those are the 2 things I've tried so far. But I'm sure there are many other techniques of subversion. I mean, I know people like, you know, you mentioned 16 Beaver. 16 Beaver doesn't really formally exist anymore, but it was a very vital space also because it was right near Ground Zero. So it was in that space, and it was a quite radical arts organization. But Rene Gabri and Irene Anastas, who were 2 of the founders, you know, they would always subvert by, you know, insisting on producing work that was so heavily textual that it didn't fit with the curator's idea of the visual work they had expected from that. Maybe because of, Irene has a great film called Pasolini Pa Palestine. So a lot of people had seen that and they were expecting something like that, and then they come back with this project which is all like handwritten notes on top of archival images, which I think was their way of subverting what the curator and the museum. I mean, I don't want to suggest that we're at war with the curator. That's not the situation. But we might be in a, there's just a way that the international circulation of work now, which has sped up in the last 10 years, brings with it a situation where you might not recognize why you're being programmed because it's such an unfamiliar place to you. Again, that doesn't mean you're at war with the institution, but it's important to figure out what they're trying to do. And I think my experience of the German place, which I felt was somehow thinking that the Turkish community will come in for my talk is a severe case of a misrecognition of the situation, right? And they're disappointed, I'm disappointed, and the Turkish community didn't even know that all this happened surrounding them, you know. And they're probably wondering why the Turkish artists from their community weren't programmed in, you know.
Is there a last question? Yes? Okay, right over here. Thank you.
Hi. You alluded to the fact, I mean, I'm paraphrasing you, that things are sensitive in Bangladesh, and you know what I'm talking about as well. And how history is so alive. I mean, certain facts are just there. So are there any subject areas that you want to kind of work on and bring up, but you don't want to even dare touch it?
Oh, that you want me to say on camera?
Oh,
it's recording. I mean, obviously religion. I want to make work around that, and it's sort of, it is somewhat, I mean, it's not off limits, but it can be. I do feel a bit sad that I think 30 years ago, the conversations that were possible are not possible now. I just remember being in high school and having much stronger debates about the book or the books and what's written and what's allowed and what's not allowed and what we believe and don't. And those conversations are alien, I think, to, not alien, but they're being, you know, they're being driven underground in a very particular way because they're so heavily penalized. I feel maybe similar to what I said earlier about marginal spaces. There was a way that that conversation maybe was happening and governments hadn't discovered that this was a very useful place to place their fingers onto, because by marking certain kinds of speech as banned, they build political support. So it's not that the governments were necessarily more liberal about, let's say, the question of religion, but it was not considered a profitable area to interfere with as much. And now it's considered a very profitable area, right? You can mobilize massive movements based on the idea of the heart to sentiment. Right? So that's a topic I've always wanted. I've always wanted to make a work around Fatima Mernis's book, The Veil and the Male Elite, which was a very important book when I was growing up. And there was a feminist conversation that was possible around the veil, which now, of course, speaking of 2001, has been completely hijacked, because when you have the veil as the fear figure for any Western government, then you're also obliged to defend the veil in your own situation, right? And I first started encountering that 2002, 2003, and by now, it's kind of accepted knowledge, and I accept it as well, that the veil is a resistance symbol in the West because it's a form of migrant self-identification against the desire to assimilate. There was a whole different conversation happening in the 80s and 90s, which now has kind of, it's temporarily off. I mean, when Fatima Mernissi passed away, I noticed how quiet that event was in the global South, because there's a way that the way she could be back then is almost, I mean, of course it's possible, many people are having that battle, but it's also become quite constrained. So that would be the topic I or somebody should make work about one day.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, for engaging this discussion. Thank you, Jaret and Naeem, very much. And I would highly encourage you all to go down to Power Plant. The two funerals, what's the title?
2 meetings and a funeral. It's a play on 4 weddings.
2 meetings and a funeral. I saw it in documentary, and it really, really sees me in terms of so many ways. It's very multi-layered, and it's really, really worth seeing, as is the current one as well, which you can see. So I invite you now to come and join us. There's lots of food. We don't want to go away with any food left, so you have to come and eat. So please enjoy the food and enjoy each other's company and continue the discussion. It's in the room right next door. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.